And why am I so passionate about this issue? The 40% of loss in gross income would be a huge impact all by itself. Facing becoming homeless would be a huge impact. But they coup de grace, if you will, or is it coup de grace? It's one of those. Coup d'etat? Thank you. As you can tell, French is not my first language. I'm from Georgia. We'll accept that too. The point here is that if evidence can be used to prove the truth of who did cause the pregnancy, why can we not have law that say you can't use DNA to prove who did not? Because let's be honest here. Most of the public, when I ask that question, says, well, if your son was on his way to jail for a pregnancy that you had DNA to prove he didn't commit, would you be silent? Even the feminists agreed with me that they would not be silent and they would not be okay with their son going to jail. So my selfish motivation initially on pushing forward for legislative reform was to avoid going to prison and going to jail. After a downward modification on what constitutes a felony for child abandonment, it used to be $5,000 was the limit. Well, it got reduced down to $2,501. So if you are behind in arrears, $2,501, you could actually be prosecuted as a third-degree felon for child abandonment. So I was looking at a felony. Now, what would happen to my security clearance? Poof. What would happen to my employability? Poof. What would happen to the now 6-month-old little baby girl that my wife had and I had together? What would happen to her and her mom's ability to stay in a home? Poof. Well, that offended my sensibility, and it actually appealed to the warrior in me. And the one thing that I was not willing to do is let that woman and that little girl become homeless while having to fight against an order that says, yes, you do have to pay. I was very blessed that as I started, and first I want to say thank you for Dena and for Paul and the gentlemen, the attorneys. I stumbled into how do you lobby for legislation. That's not that I was some genius. I'm an engineer by trade. This was not something I had ever decided I wanted to do in life. But I remembered back in high school, it was American law and government class that I was required to take. And I remembered the legislative process. So as I remembered that how law was, the steps you had to go through to get law passed, and now I had an attorney telling me that, well, you're going to have to change the law because the judge is not going to be willing to rule against the law. And I believe the attorneys in the room here know this thing about case law, right? Because it's the pattern. It is the pattern that has been ruled consistently, so they treat that as if it is the rule. And in my state, Georgia, and many others, it has been so consistently ruled that if you didn't discover that you were not related to the child before there was an order, then the courts traditionally would say the time limit has expired. You're like, well, what time limit? Well, I believe the French term, not French, Latin, but ignorantia de excusa, ignorance of the law is no excuse. They got me on that one. Technically, it was my fault I didn't know the law, right? But if there was a time limit, I found in Georgia there was a 1-year time limit if you found out there was something wrong with the judgment. So I filed a motion 6 months after the initial order. And the court just essentially just ignored it. Well, you need someone to sponsor legislation, right? You need a sponsor. How fortunate that the sponsor that I need for this legislation is on the Special Judiciary Committee. He's my state representative, and he lives in my neighborhood, and he was in walking distance from my house to his house, and he was in the same subdivision that I was in. I approached him about the issue, and he said, well, come on over. I talked to him over a Christmas break. I bring him legislation that is already working and already in place, working in Ohio, as the starting point for us to discuss how do we solve this issue. I do know you can't approach the issue with just being just about your story. I had to approach the issue as it is a much larger issue, and mine is just one of the stories, and they told me I was going to have to get supportive data, and we both agreed that a public hearing would be of interest to see if we could get co-sponsors for the legislation. We went ahead and approached several other legislators. I called for a public hearing. I contacted the DNA lab that provided DNA testing for the state welfare cases and for the non-welfare cases, and found out that 30% of the people they tested turned out to not be the dads. That's men and boys. I no longer have an issue that is just one person. I have an issue that is, from my opinion, relating to a systemic problem where people who have been falsely identified, misled, and some of them have done something that I did, that was signed a confession admitting to paternity before they had proof. And it's called a paternity acknowledgement. You know, where we want you to hold the baby because the baby looks like you, and oh, look, got your eyes. Oh, yes. Only problem with that approach is that if the other two guys that mom dates look like you, guess who else looks like you? The baby. Well, how can you determine, using the look-alike test, the accuracy of who has caused the pregnancy? Well, smart people figured out that that's a real hard thing to do, right? So after getting this first public hearing in place, we managed to attract 6 additional sponsors across Senate, Libertarian, and Democratic. And by the way, my primary sponsor was a Democrat. I am a fiscal conservative who votes Republican. And if you can tell by my tan, that causes me a whole lot of conflict in some areas of town. You understand what I'm telling you? The good news is, though, we brought the issue, and I found out that in order to help me reach more people, because I needed to collapse time, I would lead the effort, but I needed to reach additional people and that I was going to need help. My legislators told me that, listen, we can get this going, but we're also going to need your help. So I used the media and PR, and I hired a professional journalist who had communication skills, and we leveraged mainstream media to help me get the word out about the issue, how the issue affected men, women, and families, who in many cases were really just seeking, what is the truth about our family identity? Who's really related to me? This also led to me going into business with the DNA company that did my test for 10 years. And I can tell you, from adoptees to even senior citizens, the prevailing question comes up again and again: who's really related to me? Who's my family? If you were a person who had been adopted through the, the Child Protective Services and a host of other names and other sub-organizations, many of those kids get taken away and they never ever get reunited. But you've heard of things like Ancestry.com, MyHeritage.com, 23andMe. A lot of these people are finding out for the first time in their lives who's related to me. So when using the DNA services, I reach more people. Using mainstream media, it helped me get the word out, and I would invite people to come to a town hall meeting. And then I would tell them about, the issue. I would tell them about the impact to men and boys who were going to jail and prison based on a false allegation, provably false allegation. Listen, when the DNA results say 0.0%, that is a conclusive. It is rebuttable, but it is a conclusive scientific answer of the facts. And facts are a whole lot stronger in court, except in family court, unless you get legislation that requires that the judge cannot dismiss and overlook that evidence. You've heard of judicial discretion, right? Well, judicial discretion, before the law is changed, says that, using the best interest of the child. Now, let me translate that for you. Because the child's mother is accustomed to receiving your money, even though you're not related to the child, and you've been ostracized and cut out of the life of the child, and you're not going to see the child, and the mom says the child doesn't have to listen to you because you're not related to the child, so therefore you can't even talk to the child. However, we have an order that says you do have to pay, and it's pay or go to jail. Now, how many people will sign up for that deal? Any takers? No. If I told you that's the way it worked from the beginning, would you sign up for it? But it's according to the best interest of the child, though. So I decided to use the best interest of the child as the springboard to help the legislative reform. So I appealed to the mothers in the households that were affected by that 20, 40, 50, 60% of income that was leaving their house, going to another house where the child, her husband, had been deceived into supporting. I asked her to talk about what would be the impact to her house and how does she feel about not being able to buy her kids any clothes or toys for Christmas while they watch most of the income go across town. What do you think happened when those ladies were given an avenue to speak out? They packed the room. Let me short track this for you. We got such responsive support in the House of Representatives, the floor vote came to 163 to 0. 163 to 0. As you hear in here, you know that's not cause for celebration yet, because now you got to go through the other chamber, right? And you know about those attempts at floor amendments, right? Yes, those things came up, and man, I had to take off pretty much the entire legislative session because our bill came up quite a bit. Every time I would do media, I would reach more people. It would help me reach other people. And even for people who had opposed the legislation, the fact that we did media and we kept up with all of the people who were contacting us, we ended up identifying people who were in the districts for those legislators who opposed the bill. It was one thing for you to oppose me, but now when I got 15, 50, or 100 people in your district who are paternity fraud victims, who have family members who have gone to jail, and sometimes they're the ones who are bailing them out of jail, it became much more difficult for the opposition, specifically the National Organization of Women. I think I'm on their most hated list. It was increasingly harder for them to say this was all about best interest of the child. I was like, why don't we just call it what it really is? This is about best interest of the money. Title 4D is a sticky spot in my side. I have a passion for Title 4D because I wanted to know, why do we have such opposition to reforming and just saying, why can't we have the truth be the standard in family court, criminal court, traffic court, probate court. I'm like, well, facts matter everywhere else. Why does family court get the exemption? Well, there was something driving that, right? So as we get to the Senate, man, they pulled out the big guns. They started talking about, oh, this is going to fuel domestic violence. Yeah, the poison pill. We were very fortunate that we were able to overcome that, but I had to be at every subcommittee meeting, had to be at every committee meeting. My legislator, my chief legislator, he did advocate for the bill, but he would also defer to me when those tough questions came out. And we had to bring experts in who could share educational support for the legislators. The good news is when it all was said and done, we passed the Senate 45-5, and we obtained the autograph of the most important person after you've gotten it passed in the House and in the Senate, and that would be the governor. I had met with the governor a year earlier, and he told me there was nothing he could do about it unless legislation came across his desk. And I said, okay, I got you. I understand. I'll be back. What is miraculous about what happened in Georgia, this legislation got done in 1 calendar year. I am told in some circles this is impossible. I'm telling this story and sharing with you about what's possible when you learn the things like what Dena is teaching, what Mark is teaching, our attorneys, the professionals. I'm just an average guy who just really wanted the family court to let me live my life, disconnect me, and I asked the child's mother, look, since we love your daughter, and I have been a part of her life for 11 years, would you please let us continue to see her? And if so, I will still do things for her directly. However, what we will not agree to is stay under that pay or go to jail court order where you take 40% of my net pay. The mother said, no way. In fact, she said that not only can you not waive the child support order, but you would have to have supervised visitation just to see the kid again. And you know who would have to pay for supervised visitation, right? I'm like, okay, well, this is non-negotiable. This is something that we can't work out. And in parallel, by the way, you might ask what was happening with my case. I told you the Georgia Supreme Court rejected my appeal. I collected more data from the national labs who did DNA testing across the entire United States, and they referred me to the annual parentage study conducted by the American Association of Blood Banks. And the AABB certifies all of the labs that are used for legal parentage testing. And this includes immigration testing. You know, you want to be able to prove who's related, who's really wanting to become a citizen of the United States. Well, that's exactly what's done. Well, how do you prove who's related to each other? And probate issues and questions come up about who do you pass the property to. Believe it or not, in Georgia, legislation came up that was related to my bill. And the way we dealt with some of those committee amendments was we attached ourselves and gained additional support from other sponsors. Well, wait a minute. Biology matters if moms leave the hospital with someone else's baby. No one that I could find would say it was okay if a lady left the hospital with the wrong baby. Well, look, lady, you just wanted a baby. You got one. Be quiet. No one would say that was okay, right? And in fact, once the lady found out she had the wrong baby, hospitals have been sued. The entire hospital identity environment got changed. Man, they fingerprint babies. They do DNA on babies. They match up babies with bracelets to ensure accurate identification of babies to moms, and they put security on those floors to make sure babies didn't leave in an unauthorized fashion. You've heard of kidnapping, right? Yes, there are people who will go in and steal a baby. So biology matters when it comes to mothers. Biology matters when it comes to inheritance issues and probate. Well, then I'm like, well, gee, why doesn't biology matter when it comes to who you have said is the father of the child? Why not allow men and boys to be able to get DNA testing up front, preferably within the first week of the kid's birth? And this would allow those men and boys to make a fully informed decision based on having all of the facts. And that is a huge contrast to, well, this is who I believe is the father. This is who I believe in my heart is the father. This is who I want it to be. They're not the same things. Eventually, we did get that bill passed. As I said, our governor signed it. I had 2 meetings with the U.S. Supreme Court. We thought they were going to grant cert because after I got the national data, we found out that over 350,000 men and boys are tested per year turn out to not be the fathers nationwide. What that tells me, that depending on which state you find this out in and what the time limits are that you happen to find out about, in most cases, due to Title 4D incentives, states would roll you over because so many guys and boys think that all they got to do is just hold up their hand and say, Your Honor, I didn't do it. Really? By the time they find themselves caught in the process, even a skilled family law attorney can't get them out unless there is favorable legislation that mandates, you hear me? That mandates that when you have evidence that says, yes, somebody did cause that pregnancy. However, if this one didn't do it, under these conditions, our legislation in Georgia says the court shall vacate this order. That's a huge change. And then there are conditions where we allow for discretion. As you do know, I had to compromise. I couldn't get everything that I asked for. And eventually, on February 6, 2003, I walked out of court a broke but free man. But it told me that the system, in terms of how it operated, could be made to be more fair. And the way I appealed to the legislatures across all parties was about fairness and caring. Even legislators, and look, I appeal to everybody. Just so you know, and here's a tip, don't let your personal political ideology stifle your ability to connect with someone who is of a different party and of a different mindset. I appeal to LGBT, the alphabet. I appeal to everybody. What I'm trying to get across to you is I appeal to them all and gain support on the basis of what was fair, what was just, and for caring. And my main sponsor told me, he says, you know what, that very first hearing, I thought only you were going to show up when you asked for that public hearing. He said, maybe I thought you would have maybe 5 or 6 guys there. There were more than 60 people in the room, moms, husbands, men and women from the armed forces. I have met 5 pastors who are paternity fraud victims from their marriage. Nobody is exempt. I have attorneys who are paternity fraud victims. Police officers, firemen, no one was necessarily exempt. But what we all had in common, there were facts about the pregnancy that had been deliberately withheld from us. And that is, anyone who was involved during the window of conception could be the biological father. So with that in mind, then we should not lower the standard to who do you think it is, or to who do you believe it is, to what does the DNA say about who did it. Because for some of the men, if they're in a loving relationship where that's, okay, all right, I get it. I'm willing to adopt a child on that basis that this is not my biological child, but I will adopt them and I will take responsibility based on me knowing all this information. I have zero problems with that. But what so many people have said is that for people like me, they say that, how could you do that to that child? I'm like, well, let me ask you this question. What do you say to someone who has gone from unlimited parenting time to once every other week to none at all, and then they discover they're not related to the child? What did I do wrong? Say that part again. Oh, pay for the privilege, yes. Gentleman said, and pay for the privilege. To most people that we've come across nationwide with a sense of fairness and caring, none of them would want that to happen to a family member or friend. And if I was talking to a mom who had a son, I couldn't find a single mom, including those who contacted me after I debated Gloria Allred, attorney Gloria Allred, on Dr. Phil's show. And I won that debate, by the way. And she said at the end of it, she says, you probably should go to law school. I told her, thank you. I thought that was a pretty good compliment. I haven't found a single mom who would say that, well, it's okay if my son goes to jail for this, and he shouldn't have trusted what his girlfriend said. Or, well, the fact that his wife had extracurricular friends and he didn't find out about it, well, tough. I haven't found a mom on the planet yet who would say it's okay to put her son in jail for that. So it became very easy and appealing to people using PR, mainstream media, working with my legislators, not letting my personal political ideology, not letting that stand in the way of who would I work with. A suggestion here is become coachable. You might have an idea of how you want things to go and how you envision the victory coming, but your legislator has more experience and day-to-day hands-on working relationships with people there at the Capitol. And when they make a recommendation, my recommendation to you and I is to defer to them, but at least communicate with them so that you have an understanding about the whys and the hows. This helped me be able to speak to anybody, whether they had children or not. And it was very challenging for them to look at the families who I brought in there, those families who the husband was losing significant portions of the income and that family was suffering from a lower quality of living. We asked this question: how does best interest of the child not apply to his biological children? You're putting them in a competing position. There were legislators in tears. You've heard say, hey, what? Help people to care, right? Emotion. That is how we managed to get roughly 99.7% legislative support, and it got done in 1 year. Again, I say to you, I'm told that's impossible. My legislator, my chief sponsor, he followed me to Florida, where one man called me up and says, hey man, my son told me a story. He said he had two daddies. I said, wait a minute, son, you don't have two daddies. He said, yes, I do. And it was through that discussion with his 5-year-old playing football in the front yard that he found out the biological father's been in the picture all along, and he's the guy that's been duped. That led to me meeting Representative Curtis Richardson and Senator Al Lawson in Florida, and that led to Florida legislation getting started. And I asked my chief legislator in Georgia to help. Turns out he's a fraternity brother with the state representative in Florida. So we both went up and down the road, and as an end result, in 2006, Florida has a paternity fraud law. I continue to do major media because in the course of finding out about what happened in the other states, I learned that everybody didn't have favorable law on their books, which meant my chapter of Veterans Against Paternity Fraud in California, they had zero chance of winning without some legislation. As you know, there are multiple military bases in California, right? If you don't know, the Army, Marines, Coast Guards, a ton of them. Well, in just our one affiliate chapter, there are over 600 veterans, and the leader of the Veterans Against Paternity Fraud, he got named as the father for a child that would have had to have a 13-month gestation period. Did you hear that? For him to be the father, she would have had to have carried that baby for 13 months, and the lady filed for child support against him while he was deployed in Afghanistan in combat duty. Do you understand there's no chance that he could be in family court? And by the way, military attorneys at JAG do not represent you in family court. So he ends up being declared the father for a child that it was medically, scientifically impossible without the DNA test for him to be the dad, because he didn't make it to that hearing that they had, and the court, by the stroke of a pen, declared him the father. And when he got out of his military service, they took his money that he got for his education, because he ended up being in arrears, and he became a firm advocate for pushing for legislative reform. And I met a representative in California, and we got a bill to both sides of the House, in the Assembly and in the Senate, got it to the governor's desk. And something happened that I had not been prepared for that made me study more about Title 4D. The Child Support Enforcement Agency told Governor Gray Davis that if you sign this bill, we'll lose $30 million. So what do you think happened? He didn't sign the bill. He vetoed the bill. We had enough votes. We had enough votes in the Assembly and in the Senate to override him, but no one was willing to do it. Yes, you can override the governor if you have enough votes. However, somebody's got to lead it, and I'm going to explain why it matters. What something where Mark and I have in common is that legislation would have allowed Taryn James of the Navy, highly decorated combat vet, who ended up being afraid to get married because with him being over $25,000 in arrears for a pregnancy that he could not have possibly caused, they took away his earning potential, and he felt that if he got married, he would be dragging his fiancee down into this mire where her income could be seized to pay child support. I'm pointing this out to you because incorrect default judgments is so prevalent in California that in one of the years, I say over a 10-year period, that about 81% of the judgments were default judgment. That means if they say they served you at a house that had white picket fence, however, you lived in a house with no fence, a 2-story brick house, it's your word against the sheriff or whoever does the service of process, and because you didn't make it to that hearing, you are Carnell Alexander. Yeah, I'll talk about him in a second. His story led to Jim Runestad taking the charge for that. They approached me about that. So, number one, incorrect default judgments. It happens quite frequently. And yes, I'll be honest with you, sometimes men and boys say, I don't know the mother. Wait a minute, I didn't do it, I didn't touch her, and they make the mistake of not going to court to vehemently protest and demand a DNA test. And by not showing up, just like the military men who are deployed and out of country, by not showing up, they get declared to be the father. And because you didn't protest, then you have to fight against the prosecutor's office and the mighty army of attorneys that represent child support enforcement. They will say, Your Honor, he didn't show up at the hearing. As far as we're concerned, Your Honor, this guy's a scofflaw. He's a deadbeat dad who's trying to get out of his responsibility. And no one would let Taryn James and the other members of the group appeal. That legislation that got vetoed, we tried it again when Governor Schwarzenegger came into office, and we were able to get a compromise. Here was the compromise. They allowed us to pass a bill that had a shelf life of 2 years. Yes. So that meant anybody who knew about it could apply for getting their case revisited, use the terms in that legislation, get new evidence, a new test, and then based on the new test, be able to submit to the court and get that thing vacated. However, if you didn't know about it, and by the way, may I point out that the Child Support Agency, under no circumstances, was going to do a mass notification to all of the people who were in arrears. And since they had the database, and I don't, I can only rely on the stories I do at mass media. So guess who got Taryn James all over the news, telling his story on behalf of the military men? Look, the short story here is this. Some people were able to get out, and this leads me to this next problem. After doing this for over 10 years, I literally had to stop. I was able to get out of court. I got out. I was able to help other states with getting legislation. But people want you, if you're the leader, they want you to come to their state. They want you to come in and lead. They want you to speak to the legislators. And I'm like, I can't do it. It's one me. And I was unfunded. How many know what that does? So after about $276,000 of my own money, I'm working today instead of being retired like I could have been, because of the impact on family law and my household and what it cost me to do those massive appeals. So I'm passionate, and I join you on equal share parenting, because I remember what it was like fighting in court just to exercise what the judge had signed for me. I couldn't get the judge to enforce their order for my parenting time. But if I was 31 days late on payments, I found swift action in front of the court, and I darn near got brought up on contempt. I'm like, yeah, but my job had a layoff. I got downsized. Circumstances beyond my control. Anybody sound familiar with any of that? Heard of people? Well, these things need to be revisited, because if support payments are set so that children only be with one parent 90% of the time and has another parent who is fit, who is able, available, and willing, why do we put roadblocks in front of them? Moms, on a large part, get help. If you are a non-custodial dad, and now that the numbers have increased, non-custodial moms as well, you get told about, let's see, now, what do you want to choose? You want 30 days or do you want 180 days? Now, I have an amount that you can pay for a purge. Now, it's your choice. I won't be the one sending you to jail. It will be you selecting one of these options to go to jail. These are some very tough choices. I'm all for supporting equal shared parenting because I know what it was like to be that person who was just beating on the door saying, hey, I want to get in. Hey, I was already there at one time. I was fine until we got involved with the court. I was a valued parent until we got to the court. I paid 100% of all of the expenses, and all of a sudden we changed addresses, and my kid costs more for me to support just because we changed addresses. And I'm no longer able and willing, and then when it goes to moving across state lines, that is almost a death sentence for a relationship. And I can tell you I completely understand why after about 3 to 5 years, a lot of non-custodial parents give up. Without a support network, without finances. For some, they may not even have the opportunity to move to the other state because it will be a huge cut in pay. And the court will say, well, you voluntarily reduced your income. But what about my kid? What about the importance of me being actively involved in the relationship of my child? Well, the best thing for the child is that you pay that money. Look, I could go on, but I wanted to share those thoughts of what's possible. People can tell you that it's not possible for you to change this legislation. The biggest key to my success was leveraging PR, major media, and the faith-based community. And let me share this with you, why I don't see a lot of advocates leverage them. One of the charters and the missions of the church, whether you believe in them or not, is that they claim or are supposed to be about helping families with healing. And for many of the moms who are custodial moms, if they are the primary parent, they have a shortage of time. They're being pulled this way and that way. And what I appealed to a lot of the pastors to do with me was, let's go make some field trips to the family court on child support days. And let's have a debrief on your observations. Didn't tell them what they would see. Didn't tell them what would happen. And after that, I managed to get a ton of clergymen to get involved, saying that what was in the best interest of children is to have frequent and consistent contact with mom and dad, where they were fit parents, willing, able, and available, that those churches would then come alongside and help. And that led to things like having spaghetti nights for dads, allowing them to do things that bring a lot of dads in the community. And they arrange for counseling services, job search services, skills, opportunities to upgrade their skills. But the one thing the churches couldn't do for me, is something that those of us who support this can do, is support the people who are helping you with legislative reform. It disheartens me that I could have done a whole lot more had I been able to afford to go to those other states. I ended up having to abandon that because, remember I told you about that little baby that was at my house? She just graduated from college. But because I was available for her, unlike I was for my son, she was able to graduate about a 3.92 GPA. With me as her math tutor in college, she graduated in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. Don't underestimate the impact of what having an active, frequent contact with both parents and even the parentals, the family on both sides can do in the kid's life. But if you have advocates who can help you be more effective and you let your chief advocate have to leave the movement, which now means someone else has to step in and start that up from scratch. But guess who already had the relationships? The national office had the relationships. So this is not a plug for me. I'm asking if you can and are able, help AFESP be able to help Mark expand so he can give up his Uber job. You hear me? But at the same time, in your own organizations, become strategic on putting together a sustaining funding plan, because you can run on passion for a good 2 years, maybe 3. But I know what happens when the electric company contacts you and the gas company contacts you and the mortgage company contacts you and you tell them about all the great stuff you did for the parenting organization. They're going to ask you, where's my money, right? And sometimes I've seen organizations fold and leave a vacuum there where all of that knowledge, skill, contacts, and relationship that could have helped them explode to a whole nother level, it died because they didn't support the organization. And many times they don't even ask for help, which now leads me into my pet peeve. When I see organizations says we're 100% member supported and 100% volunteer, I said the National Organization of Women and these other groups that I know who are fully funded, who have 100% staffers, they pay for lobbyists, and they're going to have representation every session. And I've seen them have multiple people be there at every session. And on our side, and guess what happens when our side, their boss says, nope, you can't take off today, but the committee meeting is today. And your chief sponsor is telling you, if I don't have your support, I can't back the bill. I can't continue to be the forerunner for you for this. I'm in with you. However, I'm relying on you to help me fill in the gaps. I'm asking, please build yourself, explore options to build yourself a sustaining funding plan for your own organizations and help the national organizations so that they can A, expand, B, be able to do more. Because I'm telling you, I learned a whole lot from the leadership summit here. Man, I had no idea that the things like Dena was teaching, it's the stuff that I did because I was coached by my lawmakers. I didn't even know that this actually was science behind it. What? Appeal to emotions, fairness, caring, the elephant? I had no idea. In fact, I feel smarter just because I came here to. Look, I may be a little humorous at times, but when you join such a movement like this because of what it costs you and the time and the quality of relationship with your own children, just think, if you could help be able to keep someone at the Capitol on a regular basis, because next year after you get it passed, someone will be laying in wait to start chipping away at what you had already accomplished. And if you're not there to be able to speak for it, because your chief sponsor might, what if they're term limited and they're no longer in office? If you hadn't been there and been building those relationships, guess what you got to do all over again? From square one. Well, hey, I'm Carnell Smith. I'm known as the paternity coach in some circles. What I do is I help women, men, and families with discovering the truth regarding their family identity. I'm inviting you, if you're interested in helping me be able to keep doing what I'm doing and share. I'm the author of the book, Trapped by Law, How to Stop Paying Child Support for Paternity Fraud, because I want to keep men and boys from going to jail for pregnancies that they didn't commit, and let's help the biological parents be responsible. Thank you.